The letter from the lawyer, crisp and formal on the expensive linen paper, felt like a slap. Not because it was unexpected, but because of its breathtaking, pristine cruelty. It confirmed what my father, in his final morphine-hazed days, had whispered with a regret that did nothing to soften the blow. The business, the capital, the legacy, it must stay unified. It goes to your brother, to Stephen. For you and Claire, a provision. A generous trust. But the shares, the voice, that's for him. I, Michael Thorne, the eldest son, who had spent weekends and summers since I was 14 sweating in the warehouse, learning the import-export business from the ground up, was being bequeathed a silent, passive stake. My sister Claire, the artist, was given a modest fund meant to support her delicate sensibilities. But Stephen, the golden boy with the MBA and the killer instinct, as Dad called it, got the throne. And the crown. And the scepter. The reading of the will in the lawyer's oak-paneled office was a study in restrained triumph. Stephen, in a suit that cost more than my car, gave a somber, respectful nod, his eyes never quite meeting mine. His wife, Evelyn, placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm, a gesture of solidarity that felt like a territorial claim. Claire, sitting beside me, trembled, her tears not for the lost authority, but for the brutal, final confirmation of our father's favoritism. Our mother had passed years ago. There was no softness left to mediate. The shares allocated to Michael and Claire, the lawyer droned on, are non-voting. However, they represent a substantial 30% of the company's equity each, ensuring a share in the profits proportional to. Substantial equity. Proportional profits. The words were empty. I'd seen the books. I knew how creative accounting in a family business could funnel profits into reinvestment, expansion costs, and strategic reserves, leaving the silent partners with scraps. Stephen would own the machine. Claire and I would, at best, receive an allowance from it. This was to prevent dilution, Stephen said to me afterward, his voice dripping with a sincerity so thick it was nauseating. To keep Thorne Global agile. You understand, Mike. It's business. Not personal. But it was all personal. Every late night I covered for him at the docks while he was at a cocktail party. Every client relationship I nurtured that he later claimed as his own strategic win. The time he'd restructured my logistics team out of their jobs to save costs, only to hire a more expensive, flashier consultancy. Our father had always seen my hands-on dedication as mere labor, and Stephen's boardroom pitches as genius. The numbness lasted a week. Then, the first board meeting as a non-voting observer ignited the fuel simmering in my gut. It was about the warehouse, Warehouse 7, the original, the one our grandfather built. It was nestled in a now-prime urban renewal zone. Stephen and his sleek new partners had a proposal: sell the land for a massive profit to a developer planning luxury condos. The operations would be moved to a cheaper, automated facility an hour outside the city. It's progress, Stephen announced, clicking through a glossy PowerPoint. Sentiment can't dictate cash flow. That warehouse wasn't just sentiment. It was the soul of the business. It was where our grandfather had painted the first Thorne logo by hand. Where our mother used to bring us lunch. It housed the specialized smaller-scale operations that served our oldest, most loyal clients Stephen deemed low margin. It was also where most of the long-term employees, people who'd taught me everything I knew, still worked. The new facility would require a fraction of the staff. I spoke up, my voice foreign in the plush room. The cost analysis doesn't account for the loss of institutional knowledge or the goodwill with our founding clients. The automation transition is risky. This is short-term gain for long-term. Stephen cut me off with a gentle, pitying smile. Michael, we appreciate your emotional connection to the bricks and mortar. But the data is clear. The vote, please. The hands went up. It was unanimous. My non-voting shares meant my chair was merely furniture. That night, I drove to Warehouse 7. I walked past the silent forklifts, the stacked pallets of goods from across the globe, the faint smell of coffee and spices that was the scent of my childhood. Old Joe, the night watchman, waved from his booth, his face lined with a lifetime of loyalty the board had just rendered obsolete. "Heard they're gonna sell the place, Mr. Michael," he said, his voice rough. "The board voted for it, Joe," I replied, the words ash in my mouth. He just nodded, a world of disappointment in his eyes. Doesn't seem right. It wasn't. And in that moment, the path forward, terrible and absolute, crystallized in my mind. They wanted to erase this place for money. They had erased my inheritance for power. They saw value only in what could be traded, never in what was built. If this place was just an asset to be liquidated, then my shares were just an asset to be managed. And I was done being managed. The plan formed not in a rage, but in a cold, clear silence. I would not contest the will. I would not plead. I would participate, perfectly, in their own game. I would liquidate my asset. Selling non-voting, minority shares in a privately held company is not simple, but it's possible. There are always buyers, rivals looking for a foothold, private equity vultures sensing family discord. I used a network of contacts Stephen had never bothered with, people who valued discretion. The process took 3 months. 3 months of watching Stephen's modernization plans roll out, of hearing about the severance packages offered to Joe and others. Packages he bragged were generous, but which were, in reality, a pittance for decades of service. Every signature I placed on the sale documents felt like laying a brick. I felt nothing. Claire, when I told her my intention only after the first major offer, was horrified. "Mike, it's all we have left of it. That money is our security." "This is for our security," I told her, my voice calm. "And it's not all we have left. We have our name. And he's burning it for kindling. Trust me." The look in her eyes was one of fear, not of me, but for me. But she trusted me. She always had. The final wire hit my account. A sum so large it felt abstract. It was the quantified value of my birthright, my labor, my disinheritance. Stephen, of course, found out. The sale had to be registered. He stormed into my apartment, incredulous. "You sold to Axton Holdings? They're sharks. Why wouldn't you come to me first?" "You're not my keeper, Stephen," I said, looking out the window. "The will said the shares were mine. I disposed of them. It's business, not personal." He sputtered, trying to pivot from anger to negotiation. "We could have bought you out. At a better rate." "You had your chance," I said, turning to face him. "You gave me a seat at the table with no voice. I found a table where my money does the talking." He left, furious, already calculating how to mitigate the threat of a rival shareholder. That was his world, threats and mitigations. He had no idea what was coming. I didn't rent a storage unit or buy a getaway car. I didn't acquire a weapon. I converted my entire inheritance into the most mundane, destructive force I could, energy. I spent weeks making small, untraceable purchases. Gift cards, cash transactions at different stores across 3 counties. I bought containers, the safe, professional kind. And I bought gasoline. Lots of it. Not in dramatic drums, but in small, legal batches that raised no flags. I stored it in a rented lockup far from the city, a place paid for with cash under a generic alias. The night of the final board meeting to approve the Warehouse 7 sale contract was clear and cold. I knew the schedules. I knew the security round timings. Joe had been reassigned, replaced by a cheaper, third-party service whose patrol pattern was laughably predictable. I wore dark, nondescript work clothes. I drove a plain van I'd acquired months prior for a fictional handyman business. My heart wasn't pounding. It was steady, a deep, resonant drumbeat of finality. This wasn't an act of passion. It was a transaction. They had traded our legacy for a developer's check. I was trading their future proceeds for a statement. I bypassed the new, flimsy gate lock with ease. The old warehouse loomed, a giant shadow against the city's glow. It felt like a tomb already. Inside, the silence was profound. I didn't rage. I didn't smash anything. I worked methodically, like the foreman I should have been. I placed the containers strategically, not to destroy the structure instantly, but to ensure the contents. The inventory Stephen had already factored into his quarterly projections, the archives he considered digitalized and irrelevant, the very physical heart of Thorn Global, would be consumed. I soaked the old wooden office, the desks where real work had been done. I saved the last container for the center of the main floor, where our grandfather's original ledger was displayed in a glass case, a museum piece Stephen planned to move to the new corporate lobby. Standing there, a lighter in my hand, I felt a piercing sadness, not for the act, but for the absolute necessity of it. They hadn't just taken a business from me, they had broken a covenant. They believed everything had a price, a transferable value. I was about to teach them the cost of something that could never be bought, sold, or inherited: consequence. I didn't make a speech. I didn't cry. I lit a rolled-up piece of cloth, a rag that had once been a Thorn Global uniform shirt, and dropped it onto the trail I'd laid. The fire didn't explode. It woke. It whispered along the lines of fuel, growing in confidence, its light dancing on the steel beams and concrete walls, gradually morphing into a roar. The heat pushed against me, a physical force. I watched until I was sure the lesson was taking hold, until the old ledger's glass case cracked in the swelling temperature. Then I walked out, leaving the door open behind me. Not for escape, but for air, for the fire to grow bold and visible. I drove away slowly, obeying all traffic laws. In my rearview mirror, an orange glow began to pulse against the night sky, a false dawn heralding the end. I went home. I washed the smell of smoke and gasoline from my skin. I sat in my dark living room and waited. The call came about an hour later. It was Stephen. His voice, usually so controlled, was a shattered pane of glass. "Michael, it's the warehouse. Warehouse 7. It's gone. It's burning. They can't save it." I let the silence hang, listening to the chaos in the background of his call. Sirens, shouts. "Michael, are you there? My God, the entire quarter's shipment, the developer, everything." "I'm here, Stephen," I said, my voice quiet, calm, utterly empty. I heard the vote was unanimous. There was a pause on the line, a vacuum where his understanding began, horribly, to form. What did you say?" I repeated slowly, the board voted. It was unanimous. And then I hung up. The inheritance was now, truly, complete. They had their hollow victory. And I had my fire. The accounting, for the first time, was balanced. The silence after I hung up on Stephen was the most profound I had ever known. It wasn't peaceful, it was total, a vacuum where sound, thought, and consequence had yet to rush in. I sat in the dark, the ghost of gasoline and smoke still clinging to my senses, and watched the distant, flickering orange hue reflected on the low clouds over the city. It was done. My phone lit up again, a frantic pulsation on the glass coffee table. "Stephen." "Claire." "Stephen." Unknown number. "Stephen." I silenced it, watching the screen flare and die like a trapped insect. The world was now reacting, and I had chosen to become the immutable, silent fact at the center of the storm. I slept. Not a deep sleep, but a shallow, mechanical shutdown. When the gray dawn filtered through my blinds, the first coherent thought was of Joe, the old watchman. Had they already reassigned him? Was he safe, at home, watching the news with a heavy heart? I hoped so. The thought of him being hurt was the only fissure in my cold resolve. The news was everywhere. Local channels led with the dramatic footage, the skeletal remains of Warehouse 7, thick smoke still coiling into the morning sky like a dying breath. The headline, "Suspicious Blaze Destroys Historic Thorn Global Warehouse, Arson Suspected." They played a clip of Stephen, filmed in the chaotic night. His Armani suit was rumpled, his face smudged with soot and stark under the camera lights. He looked every inch the grieving, besieged CEO. "This is not just a tragedy for our company, but for this community," he said, his voice cracking with a performative tremor I knew all too well. "We will work with authorities to find those responsible. Thorn Global is resilient. We will rebuild." He didn't look resilient. He looked gutted. The developer's deal, the quarterly projections, his sleek automation plans, all of it was now mixed with the wet ashes on the ground. My doorbell rang at 8:17 a.m. Not the police, not yet. It was Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying and lack of sleep. She pushed past me into the apartment, wrapping her arms around herself. "Have you seen? My God, Michael, have you seen?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I've seen," I said, closing the door. She turned to me, searching my face. "Stephen called me a dozen times. He's hysterical. He said the police are talking about arson. Accelerants. He said, Her words faltered. The unspoken question hung in the air between us, charged and terrible. I walked to the kitchen, poured her a glass of water, and handed it to her. "He said what, Claire?" She didn't take the water. "He said it was targeted. Professional. He said. He asked me if you were angry enough." Her gaze was locked on mine, a mixture of dread and a desperate need for denial. "Michael, tell me you had nothing to do with this." I held her gaze. I couldn't lie to her, not after asking for her trust. But I couldn't give her the truth that would make her an accessory. "The warehouse was a symbol of everything they took," I said carefully. "Now it's gone. The money from our shares is safe. That's our future. Not that crumbling building." It was a non-answer, and she knew it. Her breath hitched. "Oh, Michael, what have you done?" "What needed to be done," I said, my voice low but firm. "To settle the account." She sank onto my sofa, burying her face in her hands. "They'll investigate. They'll look at the sale of your shares. They'll see motive." "Let them look," I said. "I sold an asset. That's not a crime. Plenty of people had motive. Disgruntled employees Stephen laid off. Competitors. The developer himself, if the sale was falling through. The world is full of people who hated Stephen's plan. I had planted those seeds long ago, in small, untraceable comments to the right people over the past few months. The investigation moved with the grim efficiency of a major property crime. Detectives visited me 2 days later. They were polite, thorough. Detective Miller, a woman with tired eyes that missed nothing, and her partner, a younger man named Alvarez. "You recently divested your substantial stake in Thorne Global, Mr. Thorne," Miller stated, not quite a question. "I did. After the terms of my father's will became clear. It was a financial decision." "And how did you feel about those terms?" Alvarez asked, his notebook open. "Disappointed," I said, meeting his gaze. "It was a family business. I'd given it years. But my father had his reasons. I decided to move on, to use my capital for other ventures." "Other ventures like?" Miller probed. "I'm exploring options. It's a significant sum. I'm being prudent." I offered nothing more. They asked about my whereabouts on the night of the fire. I provided a simple, unverifiable alibi. I was home, alone, watching documentaries. I had taken the SIM card out of my burner phone and destroyed it. The van was already at the bottom of a remote quarry lake, its plates and VIN filed off. My purchases had been made with cash via gift cards bought across a wide radius. I was a ghost. "Your brother suggests there was significant animosity between you," Miller said, watching me closely. "Stephen and I have different visions for the business," I conceded. "He sees spreadsheets. I saw people and history. Animosity is a strong word. We're not close." They left, but the atmosphere didn't lighten. The net was tightening, not around me, but around the facts, and facts were stubborn things. The fire marshal's report confirmed multiple points of origin and the presence of accelerants, a clear sign of arson. The financial pressure on Stephen became public knowledge. The luxury condo developer sued Thorne Global for failing to deliver the property as contracted. Insurance payouts were delayed pending the arson investigation. The rival firm, Axton Holdings, who now owned my shares, began making noises about board seats and operational oversight, citing Stephen's mismanagement. I became a spectator to the unraveling. Stephen's carefully constructed empire of image and leverage was collapsing under the weight of one night's fire. He called again, this time not hysterical, but eerily calm. "They're looking at you, Michael. The detectives. They're digging. Let them dig, Stephen. They'll find what everyone already knows. You were in a desperate cash crunch, selling the family crown jewels to stay afloat. You had more to gain from an insurance payout on that warehouse than anyone." I had planted that seed, too, in an anonymous vague tip to the insurance adjuster. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was a venomous whisper. "I know it was you. I don't know how, and I can't prove it. But I know." "You know nothing," I said, and ended the call. But he was right about one thing. The pressure was shifting. A week later, Detective Miller returned, alone. Her demeanor was different. Sharper. Mr. Thorne, we've been tracing financials. Not just yours. Your brother's. Thorne Global's. She paused, letting the implication hang. The sale of that warehouse was critical to your brother's liquidity. The insurance policy on it was substantial. Recently increased, in fact, after the decision to sell was made internally. I said nothing. I had merely hinted. Their investigation had done the rest. Where were you really on the night of the 12th? She asked, her eyes like flint. As I said, Detective, I was here. We have a witness. A neighbor. They saw a van, a plain white van, idling near your building's back alley around 9 p.m. They thought it was odd. My blood ran cold, but my face remained a mask. A neighbor. This one had a particular dent on the left rear fender. A crescent shape. She leaned forward slightly. We're checking every rental agency, every used van sale in a 100-mile radius. We're pulling traffic cameras. It's a matter of time, Michael. It was the first time she'd used my first name. It was an intimacy meant to unsettle. It worked, but not in the way she intended. It clarified my final move. The game was entering its end phase. That night, I went to see Claire. She was in her studio, but she wasn't painting. She was staring at a blank canvas, looking lost. They have a witness, I told her without preamble. They're looking for the van. Her hand flew to her mouth. Michael, you have to. I don't know, you have to go. You have to leave. No, I said, shaking my head. Running admits guilt. And it leaves you alone with the fallout. I took a deep breath. I need you to do something for me. One last thing. I handed her a sealed, thick envelope. This is a full confession. It details everything. The planning, the motive, the execution. It names only me. It absolves you of any knowledge. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live serpent. No. I won't give this to them. You won't have to, I said. Not unless you have to. Keep it. Hide it. If the evidence gets too close, if they arrest me and it looks like they might try to implicate you as an accomplice, you take this to your lawyer. You tell them you just found it. It's your insurance policy, Claire. To stay free. Tears streamed down her face. This is insane. I don't want this. I wanted you to have your share, not to burn everything down. Some things need to burn so new things can grow, I said, my voice softening for the first time in months. You have your money. You're free of them. That was the point. I hugged her, a tight, final embrace. Remember, only if you're in danger. Promise me. She nodded against my shoulder, sobbing. I left her studio, not to flee, but to walk. I walked through the city, past the new glass and steel towers that Stephen admired, down to the industrial riverfront where the smell of water and rust replaced the memory of smoke. I thought of my father. His obsession with legacy, with a name that would endure. He had wanted to build a monument. In trying to preserve it as a cold, efficient empire for Stephen, he had ensured its destruction. I had simply been the instrument. The confrontation, when it came, was not from the police. It was from Stephen. He cornered me outside my apartment building 3 nights later. He looked gaunt, aged a decade in 2 weeks. It's over, he hissed, his breath fogging in the cold air. Axton is forcing a hostile takeover. The insurance company is denying the claim, citing fraud. The police, they're not looking at you anymore, Michael. They're looking at me. They think I had my own warehouse torched for the insurance money. There was a poetic justice in it, so perfect it took my breath away. I had not just destroyed a building, I had turned his own tactics against him. He was being devoured by the very climate of suspicion and greed he had fostered. Ironic, I said, my voice quiet. He stepped closer, his face contorted with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. You did this. You ruined everything. For what? Because Daddy didn't love you enough. The old wound, laid bare. But it had no power over me anymore. No, Stephen, I said, meeting his glare. I did it because he didn't love it enough. He loved the idea of a dynasty. You loved the power. But neither of you loved the business, the real living, breathing thing that was built in that warehouse. You turned it into a number on a spreadsheet. So I turned it into ash. It's a fitting end. He swung then. A wild, impotent punch born of sheer fury. I didn't block it. I let his fist connect with my jaw, a sharp, bright pain. I staggered back, tasting blood. "Feel better?" I asked, wiping my lip. He stood there, panting, his fist clenched, looking at me as if I were a stranger from a nightmare. In that moment, he finally saw me. Not the overlooked older brother, not the loyal employee, but the consequence of his and our father's choices. "You're a monster," he whispered. "I'm the inheritance you earned," I replied. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched him go, knowing I would likely never see him again. The Thorn Global saga was entering its final, legalistic chapter of bankruptcy and litigation, and he would be at the center of it, fighting for his professional life. I went upstairs. The apartment felt emptier than ever. I poured a drink and stood at the window. In the distance, the city lights glittered, indifferent. The news would cycle to another story. Stephen would become a cautionary tale in business journals. Claire would, in time, use her money to build a quiet, beautiful life far from the wreckage. And me? I had traded a future of silent, resentful dividends for a single, catastrophic act of definition. I had taken the abstract value of my disinheritance and made it tangible, violent, and final. The police might still come. The witness, the van, a slip I hadn't foreseen, it could still connect to me. If it did, Claire had her envelope. My confession would protect her and close the case. But as I stood there in the silent apartment, the dull ache in my jaw from Stephen's punch, I felt a strange, hollow peace. The fire had been a purge. It had burned away the false obligations, the twisted family loyalty, the ghost of a father's approval I would never have. I had not gotten what was mine. But I had ensured that what was left of the Thorns, the name, the money, the memory, would never again be something Stephen, or anyone like him, could claim uncontested. The legacy was ashes, but in those ashes, I was finally, unequivocally, free. The accounting was, at last, settled in full. Peace, I discovered, was not the absence of conflict, but the silence that follows a decisive, irrevocable act. In the weeks after my confrontation with Stephen, that silence enveloped me. It was a sterile, watchful quiet, punctuated only by the predictable rhythms of a life in suspension. I avoided the news, but its tendrils reached me anyway. Thorn Global, battered by the denied insurance claim, the developer's lawsuit, and the predatory advances of Axton Holdings, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Stephen's face, once a fixture in the business section for his vision, now appeared in articles about corporate scandals and failed successions, his eyes hollow with a desperation that no expensive suit could mask. Detective Miller never called again. The lead on the white van with the crescent-shaped dent must have evaporated into the vast, uncooperative sea of city logistics. The investigation, I gleaned from a careful scan of online forums, had indeed pivoted heavily toward Stephen and the financial pressures he'd been under. Motive, means, and opportunity, they were painting him into a corner of his own making. The irony was so absolute it tasted like ashes. Claire, under the guise of seeking distance from the family trauma, quietly moved to a small coastal town in Maine, using her trust fund to buy a bright, airy studio overlooking the water. We spoke in coded terms on encrypted apps. She was painting again, she said. Seascapes. Vast, cleansing expanses of water and sky. She never mentioned the envelope I'd given her. Its existence was a ghost between us, a last-chance weapon we both hoped would never be drawn. My own money sat in a complex web of accounts, a passive, growing monument to my act. I felt no desire to spend it. It was not capital for a new venture, it was a war chest for a war that was over. Its purpose had been its conversion, its transformation into a statement. Now it was just a number, a reminder. I took long, aimless walks through parts of the city I'd never known, observing life that had no connection to Thorns or warehouses or legacy. I was a ghost haunting my own existence, waiting for a knock that might never come. The waiting was the punishment, and in a way, it was the sentence I had designed for myself. Then, the email arrived. It was from a sender I didn't recognize, a string of numbers and letters, but the subject line froze the blood in my veins, a crescent-shaped dent. The body was brief, devoid of salutation or threat. Asterisk the security camera at the quick stop on Elm and 9th wasn't listed in the city registry. Private installation. It caught a white van turning north at 10:47 p.m. The dent is clear. The partial plate is visible. The metadata places it on the night in question. This data has not been provided to authorities. I believe a conversation would be mutually beneficial. The old train yard. Tomorrow. 8 p.m. Come alone. Asterisk. A cold, precise fear, sharper than any I'd felt the night of the fire, lanced through the numbness. This was it. The loose thread. I had been meticulous, but I had not been omniscient. A private camera. A partial plate. It was a fishing hook, and I was snagged. The train yard was a relic, a sprawling graveyard of rusted tracks and decaying boxcars on the city's forgotten edge. By 8 p.m., it was a landscape of long shadows and echoes. The October wind whistled through broken window panes, carrying the scent of damp concrete and rotting wood. I stood in the open, feeling exposed, my hands in my pockets. "I knew you'd come." The voice came from behind a gutted switching hut. He stepped into the fading light. He was older than I expected, maybe mid-60s, with a worn, intelligent face and eyes that held a weary kind of cunning. He wore a faded jacket that might have once been part of a uniform. "You have me at a disadvantage," I said, my voice steady. "The name's Roy," he said. He didn't offer a hand. I was the facilities supervisor for the Old North Quarter, including the Quick Stop's external systems. I installed that camera myself after a series of break-ins. Company didn't want to pay for monitoring, so I kept the feed routed to a private server. A hobby. "And you reviewed the footage from that night," I stated. "I review a lot of footage. I'm a curious man, especially when a famous fire happens a few miles away." He took a step closer, his gaze analytical, not angry. "The police were thorough. They asked for all registered cameras in a 2-mile radius. Mine wasn't. I saw no reason to volunteer information. Not without understanding its value." "So you understand its value now," I said. "I understand context," Roy corrected. "I read the papers. I know about the Thorne family drama. The disinherited son. The vindictive brother. The insurance mess." He paused, letting the implications hang in the cold air. "That van didn't head toward the warehouse district from a random starting point. I traced its likely route backward, using other private cameras I know about. It's a patchy trail, but it points to a neighborhood. Your neighborhood, Mr. Thorne." He knew. He had a map, and he was holding it just out of reach. "What do you want?" The question was blunt, the core of the matter. Roy smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Not money. Not in the way you think. I have a pension. It's enough." He looked around the desolate yard. "I want out. I have a daughter in New Zealand. She's having my first grandkid. I want to go there, buy a little house near her, and be the old man who fixes things in his shed. But a move like that, it requires a certain financial ease. A nest egg that doesn't trigger questions." "You want a clean, untraceable transaction," I said, the shape of his demand becoming clear. "I want you to buy my silence with your freedom. A simple equation. I give you the server drive with all the raw footage. I give you my notes on the route analysis. You give me the means to disappear comfortably. We both get what we want. You get to keep walking free, and I get to start over far away from this decaying city." It was blackmail, clean and professional. He wasn't a monster. He was an opportunist with a very specific, understandable dream. In a twisted way, I respected it. It was a business transaction, just like all the others that had led me here. "How do I know you won't have copies? That you won't come back for more?" "You don't," Roy said simply. "But I'm not a greedy man. I want one time. Enough to change my life, not enough to live like a king. Greed is what gets people caught. I've watched it. And I've watched you. You're not like your brother. You're careful. You'd make a formidable enemy if I double-crossed you. I have no interest in that. I just want to fish in the South Pacific." The logic was sound. It was a cold calculus of risk and benefit. My freedom, the preservation of everything I'd orchestrated, for a price. "How much?" I asked. He named a figure. It was significant, but it was a fraction of my total. It was, as he said, life-changing but not king-making. A fair price for a ghost to stay silent. I need time to arrange it. Cryptocurrency. Untraceable. I expected as much, Roy nodded. You have 72 hours. Meet me back here. Same time. You bring the access codes to the wallet. I bring the drive and my notes. We verify and we part ways. Forever. He turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth. I worked in warehouses my whole life. I know what they meant. What they really meant. I read what your brother planned to do. Automate. Sell out. Treat people like spare parts. He looked back at me, and in his eyes I saw not admiration, but a grim recognition. What you did was a crime. A terrible crime. But I understand why the ghost of the old man who built that place might have wanted to choose its own fire. Then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the train yard. The 72 hours were a different kind of torment. This was no longer about waiting for fate, it was about actively securing my escape. I moved the required funds into a new, anonymous crypto wallet. The process was clinical, digital, a world away from the visceral act of buying gasoline and striking a match. Yet it felt like a continuation of the same path, using the resources from my inheritance to bury the consequences of my actions. I thought of Claire. If Roy talked, if this went wrong, the confession in her envelope would be her only shield. I sent her a single, prearranged signal through our app. Weather turning. Secure your windows. It was our code for heightened danger. She replied minutes later with a single word, secured. The night of the exchange was moonless and cold, the wind sharper. The train yard felt even more desolate, a stage set for a transaction between specters. Roy was already there, a small aluminum case at his feet. "Do you have it?" he asked, his breath a white plume. I held up a piece of paper with the wallet address and private key, laminated and sealed in a clear sleeve. The full amount, as agreed. Accessible from anywhere in the world. He nodded to the case. The server drive. All original files. My handwritten notes on the van's route, with a USB stick containing my digital maps. No copies. My word on it. How do I verify the contents here? I asked. He opened the case. Inside was a small, rugged portable hard drive and a notebook. He had a compact laptop. He booted it up, connected the drive, and opened a video file. The grainy, black-and-white footage showed the intersection. The timestamp glowed in the corner. A white van passed, turning north. He paused it, zoomed in. The crescent-shaped dent on the left rear fender was unmistakable. A few frames later, a partial license plate was visible. It was enough. He closed the laptop. The notes detail 3 other camera sightings I personally confirmed. It's a chain leading to within 4 blocks of your address. It was enough to create reasonable doubt, or worse, to convict, if combined with motive. I believed him. We exchanged items. The aluminum case felt heavy in my hand, a Pandora's box I now possessed. He scanned the crypto wallet on his phone, his face illuminated by the blue glow. He gave a slow, satisfied nod as he confirmed the balance. "It's done," he said. "I'll be on a flight to Auckland within the week. This drive, and everything on it, is yours. The trail ends with me. Good luck in New Zealand, Roy." He gave me one last, inscrutable look. "You carry your own weather with you, son. I hope you find a place where it doesn't rain so much." He walked away into the darkness, and this time I knew I would never see him again. I stood alone in the train yard, the case in my hand, the wind biting at my face. I had just purchased my continued freedom. It should have felt like a victory, a clever outmaneuvering of fate. But as I drove home, the case on the passenger seat, all I felt was a profound, deepening weariness. The fire had been an end, but it had also been a beginning of a life of watching over my shoulder, of managing loose ends, of living in the permanent shadow of my own act. When I got home, I didn't open the case immediately. I sat with it on my kitchen table, staring at it. Inside was the physical proof that could undo everything. Roy's notes, his maps, they were a narrative. A story that led to me. An idea began to form, not in a flash, but as a slow, chilling tide. Roy was right. I carried my own weather. And as long as this evidence existed, in any form, the storm could always return. I had bought it, but I didn't own it. It owned me. I took the case, a heavy-duty metal toolbox from my storage closet, a roll of industrial tape, and drove. I didn't go to the quarry where the van rested. That was a known place, however remote. I drove north for 2 hours, to a vast, state-owned forest with a deep, cold lake at its heart. I hiked in under the cover of a pre-dawn gloom, the case and toolbox heavy in my backpack. At the lake's edge, I opened Roy's case. I took out the portable hard drive. I placed it in the metal toolbox, wrapped it in the tape until it was a sealed, anonymous metallic brick. I did the same with the notebook, the USB stick, even the aluminum case itself, crushing it first. I added heavy stones from the lake shore. Then, one by one, I threw them. The weighted toolbox hit the black water with a deep, final glunk, vanishing instantly. The other packages followed. Ripples spread, merged, and then stilled. The lake was a perfect, dark mirror once more. I stood there as the sky lightened from black to deep blue. The evidence was gone. Not hidden in a safety deposit box, not stored in a digital cloud, but consigned to the silt at the bottom of an unnamed lake. Roy was on his way to the other side of the world. The only proof that remained of my crime was the memory of the fire itself, and the confession I had left with Claire. Walking back to my car through the silent pine forest, a strange clarity settled over me. The last external threat had been neutralized, not just circumvented, but eradicated. I was truly alone with what I had done. There were no more loose ends to manage, no more ghosts to pay off. The silence that greeted me was no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of a finished thing. When I returned to the city, the news cycle had moved on. Thorne Global's bankruptcy proceedings were a dry, legal story on page 6. Stephen was reportedly in talks for a plea deal on unrelated financial fraud charges related to the insurance application, a final, fitting collapse. I went to a diner I frequented, a place where nobody knew my name. I ordered coffee and sat by the window. The morning sun streamed in, clean and ordinary. A family at the next booth laughed over pancakes. A truck driver argued amiably with the waitress about the baseball playoffs. Life, mundane and persistent, flowed on. I had wanted to balance the accounts, to make the ledger of injustice square. I had done that in the most absolute way I could conceive. I had traded my future for an act of definition. But as I sat there, a free man drinking bad diner coffee, I understood the final unalterable entry in that ledger. The true inheritance was not the money, not the business, not even the vengeful power of the fire. It was the solitude. It was the knowledge that I had crossed a line from which there was no return, not into society, not into family, not even into my own past. I was the last thorn standing, but I was standing in a field of ashes of my own making. The freedom I had bought, first with gasoline and then with cryptocurrency, was absolute. And it was as vast and as empty as the sky. I paid for my coffee, left a generous tip, and stepped out into the morning. The city's noise enveloped me, the rumble of buses, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren that had nothing to do with me. I had no destination, no plan. The shares were sold. The warehouse was gone. The evidence was at the bottom of a lake. The confession was in my sister's safe hands. There was nothing left to do but to live with the fire inside, and to walk, anonymously, through the world I had remade.